There's a very specific sound Yankee Stadium makes when history happens without anyone fully realizing it's happening in real time. And on a warm Tuesday night in the Bronx, that sound rang out in the bottom of the fifth inning. A 21-year-old kid, wearing a Yankees uniform for the very first time in his life, turned on a 0-2 sweeper, drove it 392 feet into the left field seats, and in that exact moment, two things became permanently true. One, the New York Yankees officially had their newest homegrown star. And two, the guy who used to play his exact position, a guy this franchise once talked about as a future face of this entire organization, was already 3 hours south in Scranton, packing for a completely different kind of night. So let's talk about all of it, because this is one of those stories where the excitement and the heartbreak are happening at the exact same position, on the exact same roster, within about 24 hours of each other. Quick thing before we dive in. If this is your first time here, tap that subscribe button, because we cover exactly these kinds of fast-moving, real storylines as they unfold. No old recycled content, just what's actually happening right now. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's get into this. So let's rewind about 24 hours to properly set the stage, because none of what happened Tuesday makes full sense without understanding exactly how bad Monday night was for this Yankees team. New York got run over by the St. Louis Cardinals 13-7 right there at Yankee Stadium, the kind of sloppy, deflating loss that tends to force a front office's hand on decisions they've been quietly circling for weeks. And this particular loss came just hours after the trade deadline had already closed, meaning the Yankees walked away from Monday with a freshly reshaped roster and a brutal defeat, all in the same 24-hour window. That combination apparently removed whatever hesitation was left in that front office, because late Monday night, the roster moves started coming in fast. New York optioned shortstop Anthony Volpe to AAA Scranton/Wilkes-Barre. They also sent outfielder Jason Dominguez down, clearing a spot for newly acquired outfielder Heliot Ramos. And with Volpe's spot officially open, the door was finally fully open for George Lombard Jr., the organization's top overall prospect, to get the call he and this entire fan base had been waiting on all summer. Now, before we get into just how perfect Lombard's first night in the big leagues actually was, let's spend a minute really understanding what this moment means for Volpe, because this isn't some replacement-level veteran getting shuffled around a roster. This is a genuinely significant fall for a player this organization once believed could be the long-term face of their infield. Remember, Volpe won a Gold Glove as a rookie back in 2023 and held down the everyday shortstop job in the Bronx for 3 full seasons. That's not a small accomplishment for any young player stepping into pinstripes, let alone at one of the most demanding, scrutinized positions in all of professional sports. But this season, that grip on the job had already been loosening well before Tuesday's roster move made it official. Volpe found himself splitting shortstop duties with Jose Caballero for large stretches of the year, and the numbers behind that platoon tell a pretty clear story. Through 56 games in 2026, Volpe was hitting just .240, with a .325 on-base percentage and a .322 slugging percentage, adding up to a single home run and 19 RBIs across nearly 2 months of the season. For a player whose entire prospect profile coming up through the minors was built around impact offense, that kind of production simply wasn't going to hold off a rising star prospect forever, especially not one who was clearly banging on the door. And that brings us to Lombard, because his path to this exact moment has been genuinely fascinating to track all year. He actually opened this season back in AA, but climbed quickly, earning a promotion up to AAA by late April. Once he got there, even while working through some real challenges, including a stretch where 2 sprained fingers sidelined him for roughly a month, he settled in and started hitting the way scouts had been promising he eventually would. Across 56 games at AAA, Lombard batted .268 with a .405 on-base percentage and a .440 slugging mark, adding 6 home runs, 21 RBIs, and 10 stolen bases. But here's the number that really tells the story of his final stretch before the call-up. Over his last 14 games at AAA, once he fully shaken off those finger injuries, Lombard was hitting an absolutely scorching .377 with an OPS over 1,000. That's the kind of hot streak that makes a front office stop debating and start dialing. It's also worth pointing out just how much belief this organization has placed in Lombard specifically, because it says a lot about where they see this era of Yankees baseball heading. He was the club's first-round pick back in 2023, and he's been ranked as the organization's undisputed top prospect for a while now, with outside evaluators consistently slotting him among the very best prospects in all of baseball. And in one of the more telling details to come out of this entire situation, reports confirm that the Yankees actually declined to include Lombard in any trade packages during deadline discussions for star-caliber players, even with a genuine postseason push on the line this summer. That's an organization explicitly telling you, through actions rather than words, exactly how much long-term value they place on this specific 21-year-old. So Tuesday night finally arrived, and if you're the kind of storyteller who believes in dramatic timing, this one delivered about as perfectly as you could possibly script it. Lombard started as shortstop, batting 8th in the lineup, and in his very first big league at-bat back in the 3rd inning, reality hit the way it usually does for young players stepping into the majors for the first time. He grounded out a completely ordinary, forgettable first swing against a genuinely talented Cardinals starter. But baseball has a funny way of rewarding patience, because 2 innings later, with the Yankees clinging to a fresh 2-0 lead, Lombard stepped back into the box, worked the count to 0-2, and turned on a nasty sweeper, sending it 392 feet into the left field seats. Exit velocity, over 100 miles an hour. Launch angle, 33 degrees. A picture-perfect, no doubt home run in his second career plate appearance. And in the stands that night, Lombard's own parents were caught on camera embracing each other the moment that ball cleared the fence, a genuinely emotional scene made even richer once you learn a little more about this kid's baseball bloodline. His father, George Lombard Jr., actually played in the major leagues himself, suiting up for the Atlanta Braves, Detroit Tigers, Tampa Bay Devil Rays, and Washington Nationals across his own career, and now serves as the Detroit Tigers bench coach. So this wasn't just a random prospect having a good night. This was a true baseball family watching a dream, built across 2 generations, come full circle in the Bronx. And Lombard didn't just show up with the bat either, because reports out of that game specifically highlighted some genuinely sharp defensive plays from him at shortstop as well, which matters enormously given how much scouts had already praised his glove work as being essentially big league ready well before his bat fully caught up. That combination, immediate offensive impact paired with defense that was already considered polished, is exactly the kind of debut that turns a promising prospect into a legitimate headline overnight. Put it all together, and the Yankees walked away from that Tuesday night with a 2-0 shutout win over the Cardinals, with starter Ryan Weathers turning in 6 genuinely strong innings, Jazz Chisholm Jr. also going deep for New York, and their bullpen closing things out cleanly behind him, capped off by their closer notching his 25th save of the season. It was, by just about every measure, one of the more complete, satisfying nights this team has had in a while, and it just so happened to be the exact same night their newest prospect turned himself into a genuine headline in his very first major league game. Now here's where this story gets a little more complicated, because it's not just a simple story of one young player getting his shot, while an older one steps aside gracefully. Manager Aaron Boone has already indicated that Volpe's time in AAA won't just be about sitting and waiting for another opportunity at shortstop. Boone revealed that the Yankees planned to actually get Volpe some real time at second base during his stint in the minors, an effort to build out some genuine defensive versatility rather than simply parking him at the same position he's currently struggling to hold onto. Read between the lines on that decision for a second, because it tells you something pretty significant about how this front office is thinking about Volpe's long-term path back to the majors. If they were fully confident he'd simply reclaim shortstop the moment his bat came back around, there'd be little reason to start cross-training him at a new position. Instead, this feels like an organization quietly preparing for a version of the future where Volpe's path back to New York runs through a different spot on the diamond entirely, with Lombard now firmly entrenched as the shortstop of the present and, if Tuesday night was any indication, quite possibly the shortstop of the future too. Think about the emotional whiplash of that reality for a second, because it's genuinely significant. This is a player who arrived in the majors with sky-high expectations, who delivered a Gold Glove season immediately, who held down one of the most important, most visible positions on this entire roster for 3 consecutive years. And now, in the span of about 24 hours, following one ugly loss and one trade deadline roster crunch, he's not just getting sent down, he's potentially being nudged toward an entirely new defensive identity, all while the fan base's excitement and attention shifts almost entirely toward the 21-year-old who just replaced him. That's a brutal, humbling turn for any young player to process, no matter how many times you remind yourself that professional sports careers are built on exactly this kind of constant churn and competition. And it's worth sitting for a moment on just how symbolically loaded this particular transition actually is for this specific franchise. Some of the coverage around Lombard's debut has already started drawing comparisons to the last time a Yankees shortstop debut felt this significant, framing him as the youngest player to man that position for this organization since a certain legendary number 2 took over the job decades ago. That's an enormous shadow to invite comparisons to, and it's not a comparison anybody in that Yankees front office is likely making lightly. But after a first game that included a home run, some sharp defensive work, and a genuinely emotional moment shared with his own family in the stands, it's not hard to understand why that kind of hype is already building around him after just one night. So where does this actually leave things heading into the stretch run of the season? The Yankees now have a legitimate, blue-chip prospect handed the everyday shortstop job in the middle of a real playoff push, with an immediate opportunity to prove that Tuesday night wasn't just a feel-good debut, but the start of something sustainable. Volpe, meanwhile, heads to AAA carrying real uncertainty about his long-term path back to the Bronx, working through both his offensive struggles and a brand-new positional challenge at the exact same time. And this entire fan base is left holding 2 very different, very real emotions simultaneously: genuine excitement for a homegrown star potentially arriving right on schedule, and genuine sympathy for a young player who once carried the exact same hopes and dreams, now watching someone else step directly into the spotlight he used to occupy. Let's take a step back and really sit with just how brutal that Monday night loss actually was for this Yankees team, because it's important context for understanding why the front office moved as fast as they did. Losing 13-7 at home isn't just a bad final score. It's the kind of game where you watch your pitching staff get hit around, your defense struggle to make routine plays look routine, and your entire lineup fail to generate any real answer for a full 9 innings. For a team with legitimate postseason ambitions, that's exactly the kind of performance that forces uncomfortable conversations in the front office that same night. And when you combine that kind of sloppy loss with a trade deadline that had just closed hours earlier, deadlines that force every organization to take a hard, honest look at exactly where their roster stands heading into the stretch run, you get exactly the kind of environment where a decision that's been quietly building for weeks finally gets pulled off the shelf and executed. And make no mistake, this wasn't a decision made in a vacuum overnight. Reports out of the organization had already made clear that general manager Brian Cashman was looking for a real boost at shortstop heading into the trade deadline, a signal that patience with Volpe's underwhelming production had been running thin for a while already. When that same trade deadline came, and went without New York landing a proven veteran upgrade at the position from outside the organization, the writing was essentially already on the wall. If they weren't going to solve this shortstop question through a trade, the answer had to come from within, and thankfully for this front office, they happened to have exactly the kind of blue-chip answer sitting one level away in AAA, just waiting for his number to be called. Let's dig a little deeper into Volpe's season 2, because the surface-level batting line only tells part of the story here. A .240 average, with a single home run through 56 games represents a legitimately significant power outage for a player who was supposed to bring real thump to the middle of this lineup. Remember, this is a player who's shown flashes of real impact hitting earlier in his career, the kind of upside that made him such an exciting prospect coming up through this same farm system that just produced Lombard. But this season, that power simply never showed up in any consistent way, and once his defensive value alone wasn't enough to justify consistent everyday at-bats over a surging Caballero, and an increasingly big league-ready Lombard breathing down his neck from AAA, this outcome became close to inevitable. Now let's really dig into that Lombard at-bat sequence one more time, because the storytelling of it genuinely deserves the extra attention. Think about the pressure sitting on a 21-year-old walking into Yankee Stadium for the very first time as a major leaguer, batting in the middle of a real, live playoff push, with every single camera in that building and every single Yankees beat reporter watching his every move. His first swing of the night results in a routine ground out, the kind of anticlimactic moment that could easily rattle a young player trying too hard to make an immediate statement. But instead of pressing even harder in his very next at-bat, Lombard did the opposite. He worked the count all the way to 0-2 against a Cardinals pitcher who came into that game with real, tangible success against this exact Yankees lineup, and rather than chase something out of the zone or panic under a full-count style disadvantage, he stayed disciplined, recognized a sweeper he could handle, and put an absolutely perfect swing on it. 100-mile-an-hour exit velocity, a 33-degree launch angle, 392 feet of pure, no doubt contact. That's not luck. That's the kind of at-bat that scouts spend years projecting a prospect will eventually be capable of producing on the game's biggest stages, and Lombard delivered it in literally his second career plate appearance. And that moment with his parents in the stands deserves even more attention too, because it adds a layer of real, human weight to what could have just been another statistical highlight. Think about what George Lombard Sr. has actually witnessed across his own life in this sport. He played in the major leagues himself, moved through 4 different organizations across his own playing career, transitioned into coaching, and eventually built a respected career as a bench coach at the highest level of the sport. And now, sitting in the stands at Yankee Stadium, he got to watch his own son not just make his major league debut, but do it with a home run in just his second big league at-bat. That's not just a nice story for a highlight package, that's a genuinely rare, full-circle moment that connects 2 generations of one baseball family, and it's exactly the kind of moment that turns a standard prospect call-up into something the entire baseball world stops and pays attention to. It's also worth talking a little more about what this specific call-up says about how the Yankees have historically operated compared to some other organizations around the league. This is a franchise that's had a complicated, sometimes contentious relationship with its own prospect development over the years, occasionally getting criticized for either rushing young players before they're truly ready, or conversely, holding elite prospects back in the minors longer than necessary due to service time considerations or short-term roster pressures. The fact that they made the call to promote Lombard right in the thick of what's shaping up to be a real playoff race, and explicitly protected him from being included in any trade packages at the deadline just days earlier, suggests a level of genuine organizational conviction in this specific player that goes beyond just filling an immediate roster hole. They didn't just need a warm body at shortstop. They specifically wanted this player, at this exact moment, and Tuesday night's performance did about as much as a single game possibly could to validate that decision immediately. Now let's circle back to Volpe one more time, because the human side of his story deserves just as much attention as the excitement surrounding Lombard's arrival. There's a version of this story where Volpe simply disappears from the conversation for a while, grinds through some difficult weeks in AAA, and either forces his way back up through pure production or fades quietly into a bench or utility role somewhere down the line. But Aaron Boone's comments about actively working Volpe in its second base suggest this organization isn't just parking him and hoping the bat comes back around on its own. They're proactively trying to build out real value in a different way, positional flexibility that could make him a genuinely useful piece on this roster even if Lombard firmly holds down shortstop for years to come. That's actually a fairly thoughtful, forward-looking approach to handling a former Gold Glove winner and homegrown talent, rather than simply discarding him the moment a better option arrives. Whether Volpe embraces that transition and turns it into a legitimate path back to consistent big league playing time, or whether this ends up being the beginning of a longer, more complicated chapter in his career, is a story that's genuinely going to take real time to play out. So step back and look at the bigger picture here, because this entire sequence, one ugly loss, one trade deadline, and one franchise-altering debut, all happening inside about a 24-hour window, is exactly the kind of whirlwind stretch that ends up defining how people remember an entire Yankees season down the road. If Lombard keeps hitting anywhere close to the way he did in his first game, this becomes the moment everybody points back to as the real turning point of this roster, the night this organization's next great homegrown star officially arrived. And if Volpe manages to fully reinvent himself through this new positional versatility and forces his way back into relevance later this season or next, this becomes a much more complicated, much more layered story about resilience and adaptation inside one of the most pressure-packed organizations in all of professional sports. And there's one more piece of this we're sitting with before we wrap up, because it speaks to just how quickly perception can shift in professional sports. A week ago, most casual fans following this team probably weren't spending much time thinking about George Lombard Jr. at all. He was a name buried in prospect rankings, someone Yankees diehards tracked closely, but the wider baseball world mostly overlooked. Anthony Volpe, meanwhile, was still very much the incumbent, a former Gold Glove winner with 3 years of big league experience, the guy this fan base had already invested years of hope and frustration into. Fast forward one loss, one trade deadline, and one unforgettable debut, and that entire dynamic has essentially flipped overnight. That's the nature of a true meritocracy inside a major league organization, and it's exactly why nights like Tuesday feel so significant, not just for the box score, but for how an entire fan base recalibrates its expectations for the future in the span of about 3 hours. This story is going to keep developing fast over these next few weeks, so if there's a new update on how Lombard follows up that debut, or how Volpe adjusts to life in AAA, or where this shortstop situation eventually settles for good, you already know exactly where to come back for the full breakdown, straight from the source, no fluff, no filler. This video is created for entertainment purposes. All information shared is based on publicly available reports, team statements, and ongoing developments as of the time of publishing, and details may change as the situation evolves. This content is intended to celebrate and discuss these athletes and organizations respectfully. No disrespect is intended toward any player, coach, or organization mentioned. Disclaimer: this video is for entertainment purposes only, based on publicly available reports and ongoing developments. No disrespect is intended toward any individual team or organization mentioned.